Welcome back. Now, more countries are joining the African continent's calls for its permanent inclusion in the United Nations Security Council. During his address at the recently concluded United Nations General Assembly, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa reiterated his calls for urgent reforms in the Security Council to ensure that Africa is represented. For more on this discussion, I am now joined on how to set these reforms in the UN Security Council. I am now joined by Professor Anthoni van Nieuwkerk, who is the Professor of International and Diplomacy Studies at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. Professor van Nieuwkerk, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Is this another case of Africa begging for a seat at the table?
Sure. Good evening, Masa. Thank you for the invitation. It's such an important topic, you know, because as we are speaking, if you turn your TV on to Al Jazeera, you will see another strike by Israel trying to eliminate Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So there's an expansion of a regional war in the Middle East, and it's taking a very dramatic turn. And this is one reason amongst many for the Security Council to really speak with one voice and with authority to deal with, you know, the breach of international peace and security. And in that context, it is important, you know, for Africa to participate in these proceedings, because apart from Ukraine or Gaza, there are many conflicts raging on the African continent, of which probably Sudan is the biggest one, the largest number of displaced people ever in the world. It's a humanitarian crisis. Yet, on the decision-making body at the apex of the United Nations, in the Security Council, there are no Africans with permanent seats who can shape the agenda and help take decisions. So there's all-round agreement internationally that Africa deserves to be on the Security Council, not as a rotating non-permanent member, but to take up, you know, substantive seats. But there are many reasons why this might not work out very well for us here in Africa.
And we'll get into those reasons as well. But, you know, just speaking of how imperative it is also for Africa to have a voice and a seat at that table, is it quite alarming as well, Professor, that in 2024, we're still finding ourselves as being viewed as kind of like the dark continent still? Issues about Africa being discussed at a level where Africans aren't even at that table. Surely this should, I mean, we'd think that by now, all these years later, that these reforms would have been made.
Yeah, no, indeed, Masa, I must agree with you. It's really intolerable that, that in terms of shaping global agendas, Africa is nowhere to be found with an authoritative voice, whether it's climate change or addressing the unequal relations between the global north and the global south, economic exploitation, the theft of African natural resources by powerful countries from the east and the west, and then of course this issue now of maintaining or recovering from violent conflict, not only in Sudan but, you know, across many parts of Africa, instigated often by outside sources. So yes, it's a historical injustice. It needs to be reset. And I'm afraid, you know, there's no good news as far as I'm concerned. The American administration, the outgoing Biden administration, let me put it like that, tongue in cheek, has offered Africa it says, we will support you to get 2 permanent seats on the Security Council, but don't ask for the veto. Don't ask for much more, you know. There are limits to what you can do on the big table. We will treat you, this is my view, we'll treat you as minors. You can come to the table, we want to hear from you, but don't think you can take part of these critical discussions as equals. This is very unfortunate. And there are very powerful reasons why this offer by America or by the West for Africa to join the Security Council might not even work. It is quite clear to me that those who have permanent seats on the Security Council, there are 5 of them, 3 Westerners and 2 Easterners or Global South. they are not very keen to expand the membership of the Security Council with the veto power as well, because they dilute their own power and influence and interests. And by the way, Masa, ask yourself, if Africa gets, to choose two candidates, what about the rest of the world? What about Brazil or Germany or Japan or India? These are important, or Indonesia, or Egypt, Saudi Arabia. These are important countries. They are leaders in their own right. So it's already very tricky. And then the point I want to make, which I wrote about, is that if Africa indeed gets that opportunity, the door opens, we walk through, who from the 54 member states in Africa will get to represent the continent at the Security Council? How do we choose those two candidates?
Yeah, that will be quite an interesting one to see as well. And also considering the role that African countries, several African countries have made in the world as well. But bringing it back to South Africa, for instance, when we're talking about international relations and the Middle East, we've seen that South Africa has a strong voice and can play a role in such talks. And I want us to listen to this bite by President Cyril Ramaphosa when he was speaking about this topic in general.
78 years since its formation, the structure of the United Nations Security Council remains largely unchanged. Africa and its 1.4 billion people remain excluded from its key decision-making structures. This cannot continue. The Security Council has not fulfilled its mandate to maintain international peace and security. The UN Security Council must be reformed as a matter of agency.
I mean, that's, to the point that you've been making, Professor, that Africa remains largely excluded from conversations that even have to do with Africa itself. What did you make of what the president had to say there?
Yeah, I think President Ramaphosa speaks very well on international platforms, and he articulates the African position very clearly, and he does it very well. He doesn't push South Africa to the forefront. He is more statesman-like and a leader, really, explaining to the world at large what the issues are. But that's the first point. The second one is, it is not a secret that South Africa is keen to play that leadership role at the apex of the UN Security Council. If you push me, I would say that South Africa probably meets the criteria for sitting on, for taking a permanent seat, which is you need to have, leadership qualities, diplomatic experience, peacekeeping and mediation experience, and then the resources, which is critical, I think, Masa, it's really critical. The resources, the team of experts behind the scenes to inform your diplomats who sit at the council about all of these issues. And it's a 24/7 job. It's an ongoing, full-time, permanent job. You really need to have smart people to deal with these issues. I think we have a good chance, if the African Union decides to propose South Africa as one of the two seats, I think we have a good chance to do that. I want to say very quickly that if we do that, if this transpires, we overcome all the obstacles from the permanent five, the door opens, we walk through, it is going to require a serious commitment from not only the president, but from the government of national unity to put resources at play to deal with the difficult issues on the international stage. And let me say, let's not be naive about how difficult this is going to be. South Africa will then, if it sits there together with the permanent five, it will have to have a firm position, a strong voice on the conflict in Ukraine, on the problems in Gaza, the Palestinian cause, the problems of nuclear warfare that might face us very soon, the role of China in their own environment, all the conflicts in Africa. In fact, those two African countries, when they join the Security Council, the first question from the permanent five would be, welcome brothers, welcome sisters. How much can you invest in peacekeeping? Because after all, this is your continent in conflict. And right there, for South Africans, we have to think very carefully about how we commit resources and play this international game so that we benefit as a country, but also lead the continent in terms of making peace and keeping the peace.
Yeah, and it will be quite a tricky one when we consider all the budget cuts across the board as well. But back to this offer as well, made by, like you were being facetious there about Biden's outgoing administration, Biden's US. But some have criticized this offer of 2 African states joining the UN Security Council, saying this shouldn't be viewed as some noble act or some act of benevolence, because, in fact, this is just a way to counter what African countries are already looking at, which is countries like China and Russia. So it's basically a fight for the West to remain powerful, particularly over Africa as well, and to prohibit the likes of your Russias and Chinas.
Yes, Masa, you summarized that position very well, which is also the way that I think about this. I mean, to put it in a slightly different way, to use different words to make the same point, internationally we are going through a transition, globally, from one world order dominated by the West and by America to a new multipolar world where the West and the US in particular doesn't have all the say about decisions that affects all of humanity. In fact, the power and the influence of the Americans and the West is being challenged by a very strong, assertive group of Southern or Global South countries in the BRICS alliance, led by China. And so there's a contest that we face as Africans, and Africa is an attractive sort of partner for the one or the other bloc. We've got lots of natural resources that the global economy needs. We've got voting power, 54 countries, and some countries in Africa, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Algeria, Egypt, and so on, are very attractive alliance partners. And so these 2 blocs want Africans to join them, the one or the other. And so when Americans come and make an offer generously to say, we will support you to get 2 seats on the Security Council, it is not because they like us, it's because they need us. And because they want to counter the influence of Russia and China in Africa and in global affairs in particular. So it's an offer that comes with conditions that we have to consider very carefully.
It's an offer that comes with conditions, Prof. Is it an offer that comes with benefits?
I struggle to make the argument that we will, on balance, benefit from participating in the Security Council. I really fear. I mean, that we've got wonderful diplomats and ambassadors and representatives in DIRCO and in the presidency, and South Africans in general. Very powerful voices. We play a leadership role in Africa. But if we go to the United Nations Security Council, we sit on a permanent seat, we will face the Americans, the British, the French, the Chinese, the Russians. These are superpowers in their own right. And I'm asking whether we have what it takes, also under the conditions of a government of national unity, to say to these 5 powerful allies or partners, at the table, we know what we want and we insist on the African agenda being promoted. And if the Americans say, but we opened the door for you, you have to play our game. How do we resist that? This is dangerous terrain. We can't afford, in my view, to please the West at the expense of the big investment that South Africa is making in participating in the BRICS alliance, which I think ideologically and politically is where the South African government's heart really lies.
And finally, Prof, before I let you go, you speak about the context of the GNU conditions when it comes to particularly international relations and international policies and where we stand when it comes to, for instance, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and what's going on in the Middle East. Within that GNU itself, there are contradictions of how these things should be viewed, which parties should be supported. So never mind in, the process of getting a country, one or two African states, a seat at the table, there's going to be a bit of tussle between the internal governments themselves, would you say?
Yeah, no, you put your finger on it. I fear that the GNU, which is really a coalition government, with two partners and then several smaller ones cobbled together, do not have shared values and interests so that they can present a unified South African voice when it comes to the tricky issues on the international agenda. I'm not talking about the run-of-the-mill sort of processes and procedures. We go to Paris, to the Paris Agreement. We work on climate change. We want South Africa to attract investment. We promote tourism. We can all talk the same kind of language. But when it comes to the real critical issues that might divide us, which is Ukraine and support for Russia, or the Palestinian cause and the violence that is happening as we speak tonight in Gaza and in Lebanon, the GNU doesn't talk the same language. They're not yet united. They don't share values. Having said that, I'm also of the view that when it comes to the international relations portfolio, I do believe that the ANC is firmly in control of that portfolio, as they are with two or three other critical portfolios. And they won't let go, and they won't let others determine the agenda when it comes to these critical issues.
Professor Anthoni van Nieuwkerk, thank you so much for your insights and giving us your time this evening. Really appreciate it.